Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
Good morning and most welcome to this webinar on land rights, climate resilience and development cooperation. My name is Mats Horsmar. I'm Deputy Managing Director at the EBA, but today I will serve as your moderator for this webinar. As we all know, land is a key asset and production factor in most situations around the world. But especially so where people are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. Furthermore, the relation to land is contributing to people's identity. We retain strong links to where we come from. In many places, there are also religious dimensions to such links. Control over land is also a source of power, which makes land a highly political and potentially contested resource. In this webinar, we will learn about a new study published by the Expert Group for Age Studies. This report focuses on yet another aspect of land. It concerns land rights and climate adaptation. In low and middle income countries, climate change disproportionately impacts rural as well as marginal sections of the population. The importance of land rights for climate adaptation has been underlined by others, such as the IPCC, but the authors of this report thought that we need to understand such relationships much better. The report is written by Kathleen Klaus and Emma Elversson, both who are researchers at Uppsala University. It focuses on land rights in Kenya and the space and scope that land tenure and land rights give for households and individuals in adapting to climate change. But even if the focus is on Kenya, the analysis in the report makes it more widely relevant for also other situations. Following their presentation, we will have a panel discussion. As panelists, we have with us 3 persons. You will meet Henrik Häger-Brundin, you will meet Catherine Boone, and you will meet Mattias Rantanen. I will introduce them more properly later. And I should also say that after the panel discussion, there will be time for questions and answers with all of you in the audience. Please use the Q&A function at Zoom to post your questions or comments, and we'll bring them to the table later. But now, Kathleen Klaus, you are Assistant Professor and Associate Senior Lecturer at the Department for Peace and Conflict at Uppsala University. During the last year, you've also been visiting scholar at the Department for Political Science at Berkeley in California. And Emma Elversson, you are also Assistant Professor and Associate Lecturer at the same university, but another department, the Department of Government. And you're also a researcher at the Conflicting Objectives Research Nexus at the university. So, Kathleen and Emma, please go ahead and introduce the report that you've written.
Thank you, Mats, for that introduction. And good morning, everyone. So let us begin here. So we were interested in this broader question or problem of the way in which climate change and land and livelihoods intersect. And of course, or kind of our starting point was that as land scholars, that land has and land tenure has really profound consequences on different forms of social and political behavior. And so we wanted to figure out how it was that tenure was shaping the ways in which people can adapt to climate change, right? And so we're coming with this premise that land tenure should in some way be affecting people's, yes, their livelihood and belonging, but also the agency and efficacy and collective action capacity. So these concepts of agency, efficacy, and collective action capacity will keep coming up. And another kind of starting premise is that insecure or contested land rights can undermine cooperative forms of adaptation and might also, in kind of more unique circumstances, actually fuel or incentivize violence. And so we suggest these broad kind of questions of the ways in which land and rights to land are affecting climate change also intersect with Sweden's aid priorities. And so the research question that we're asking in this paper or this report specifically is, how is it that land tenure shapes household level climate resilience strategies? And I'll put the emphasis there on household level. And so we look at 3 different dimensions of climate resilience, which I think depart in some ways from conventional understandings of resilience and adaptation. The first is the more conventional household and collective forms of climate adaptation. The second is looking at the ways in which people organize collectively, and in particular, what we're calling political engagement. The ways in which they push for political change as a mechanism of addressing climate threats. And the third strategy here, you can kind of think of it as going from like the least contentious to the more contentious, is thinking about support for violence or participation in violence as a form of climate resilience, insofar as thinking about violence, for example, as a form of violent redistribution, right? When resources are scarce, for example, under what conditions are people willing to use or support violence in order to protect their resource access? And now, let's see, I will hand it over to Emily.
Okay, thank you. So the overarching argument here that we have in this report is that how people access and control land and the rights that they hold shape the strategies of climate adaptation and resilience that they pursue. As both Kathleen and Mats already noted, the importance of land is not something new. There's a large literature that has shown that land is central in people's lives for their agency and for their decision making. Holding land is something that confers belonging, social status. It denotes territorial boundaries. It establishes relationships of power and control. And of course, land serves as a critical livelihood resource. And the link between land rights and climate adaptation, more specifically, has also been the subject of study. But existing research has to a large extent treated land tenure or land security as a binary variable. So, for instance, focusing only on whether or not individuals and households hold formal ownership of land. But formal land tenure security does not always translate into perceived security. So land rights and the establishment of such rights are deeply political, which means that confidence in your rights in many cases depends on the government of the day. And even when holding a title deed, an individual may question their tenure security because they belong to a marginalized community, for instance. They worry about a state or private actor expropriating their land. And conversely, while, for instance, residents of urban informal settlements usually have no legal right to the land that they reside on, they may feel relatively land secure because they have protection from local political elites, for instance, or because the surrounding community recognizes their claims. So we argue that studies and policies that focus only on formal land titles risk to overlook key social and political dynamics that might undermine tenure security. In addition, it's often assumed that private ownership is necessary in order to promote adaptation, because individuals then have stronger interest to invest in their land. Private ownership is then often conflated with strong rights, but there are many studies that indicate that communal tenure can also engender strong land rights at the individual level. So what we do in the study is that we move beyond binary conceptualizations of tenure as being either secure or insecure, and instead we examine how varied land tenure systems, land rights, and perceived land security independently and jointly shape the ways that people respond to climate threats. And this, as our findings demonstrate, allows us to uncover more complex relationships at play and generate new insights that are relevant for development cooperation. So to briefly sort of preview the findings, this approach allows us to study how different dimensions of land tenure shape, as Kathleen mentioned, agency, collective action, and grievance, in turn affecting how Kenyans adapt or mobilize in the face of climate threats. And our findings indicate that secure rights strengthen people's agency to invest, that land governance rules or tenure regimes shape collective action, and that where people feel tenure insecure, grievances are activated, fueling mobilization and in some cases support for coercion and violence. So we'll talk you through a bit more how we set up the study to reach these conclusions. And I'll hand back to Kathleen.
Okay, so as you know, we conducted the study in Kenya. And Kenya is a really interesting place to examine these questions for many reasons, in part because there's a lot of local variation in each of the variables that we're interested in. So there's high climate vulnerability that kind of equally exposed, but different forms of vulnerability. So as I mentioned, we did our survey in 2 counties in Mombasa, along the coast, in Laikipia, which is green on the map in front of you. And so in this regard, we're also able to pick up both on kind of more rural and urban spaces, but also different land tenure systems, diverse livelihood forms. Laikipia in particular has perhaps the highest kind of within a single county, a lot of varied forms of land tenure. And so it's a really interesting space to sample from and be able to pick up on that very local variation in both forms of tenure and degrees of tenure security. So we did this survey with 1,000 respondents in March of 2024. And then following the survey, we followed up with focus groups in both of these counties. And we're happy to expand a bit more on who it exactly was that we were engaging with in these focus groups, perhaps in the Q&A. Okay, so a bit about our measurement. So recall that our main concept here is land tenure, but we break this broader concept of tenure into 3 dimensions. And then with each of these 3 dimensions, we have subdimensions. So the first dimension we're looking at is the tenure system, what Kathy Boone here would call the tenure regime. Right? So the tenure system, we think broadly in terms of communal land, private land, and government or public land, as it's sometimes referred to. The second dimension is land rights. Right? We have 2 measures here. One is what we created a land rights index. And so we call this the extent of rights. And this is based on 5 different measures capturing a respondent's ability to make decisions over the use of land, like to sell land, rent land, use land as collateral, transfer land, or make decisions about inheritance. So those could be formal or informal. We're kind of ambivalent about kind of the formality of those rights, and we're interested more in the respondent's perception of their ability to make such decisions. And then the second measure of land rights is just a title deed, right? Does the respondent or household head hold a title to their land? The third dimension is getting at this perceived element, what we'll often refer to in this talk as insecurity or security. Right? So it's just a respondent's their own assessment of the security of their rights to land. And we also have another measure of that, which is fear of eviction. And we find that in many cases, fear of eviction is a more concrete way of asking or getting at insecurity. Okay, so that's our land tenure, which is our main explanatory variable, our main concept explaining the outcome of interest, which is these different climate resilience strategies. So climate resilience, again, here we have three main ways of measuring climate resilience. And within kind of these three dimensions, we have subdimensions. So let me walk you through these briefly. So our first broad outcome or resilience strategy is what we're calling household and collective adaptation. So we have a measure that just asks respondents whether they've engaged in kind of household level adaptation in the past few years. Then we ask about whether they've engaged in community level or forms of adaptation or for example, restoration efforts. And then we push them a little bit and we ask them to choose what form of adaptation they're more likely to select or prefer, right? Whether they prefer relying only on their household or whether they prefer relying on collective means of climate adaptation, right? So this provides, in some ways, right, because we're first forcing a choice, it gets at preferences in a way that the other two measures do not. Our second category here is what we're broadly calling political engagement. And we have three measures here. The first is whether they have joined any political protest, whether it has to do with climate or not. The second is their interest or willingness to join a climate-related protest in the future. And then the third is kind of more everyday and just the extent or whether a respondent has joined others to raise some issue. And then the final category or kind of dimension of climate resilience that we measure is support for violence or support for coercion. And we measure this by agreement with the statement that climate change adaptation requires, in quotes, taking back land occupied or taken by outsiders. So it really does get in at this kind of zero-sum nature of resource control and provides a way of getting at least tacit support for taking those more coercive measures as a way to make oneself safe in the face of climate-related threats. Okay. I won't go into this too much, but here you can see that in our models, we also control for a number of important factors from climate exposure, gender, education, age, whether the respondent is in the ethnic majority. We have a poverty index, an access index, and then we have dummy variables for whether they are pastoralists or farmers, and then a rural dummy as well. So again, I'm happy to expand on this in the Q&A. And then for analysis, we did regression studies using a mixed level logistic regression, and we had random effects at the sub-county level. So that kind of helps us to account for other differences that might be occurring at the sub-county level. Okay, so let me walk you through results kind of quickly. So what you're looking at here, recall that these are our three main dimensions of climate resilience, right? And on the kind of the columns going down, you have our different ways of measuring land tenure and tenure security. Okay, so let's take this first one, right? How is it that land is affecting one's proclivity or likelihood of engaging in household adaptation? And here we see that the extent of land rights and having a title deed are quite positive and predictive, right? This is indicating that tenure security is increasing a person's likelihood of engaging in household level adaptation. Moving on now to our second outcome, collective, right? When do people to what extent does land predict collective adaptation, right? And here we see that living on government land. So private land actually is negatively, so there's a negative association, right? So meaning that people living on private land tenure are actually less likely to engage in these collective efforts, though people living on government or public land are more likely. Extent of land rights is predictive, as is having a title deed. And then in terms of like what predicts a preference for relying only on one's household, here we see, not surprisingly perhaps, that living on private land predicts a preference for a household only over collective. Living on government land, right, you're less likely to prefer relying only on your household. And land rights score is also negatively correlated with a preference for household only adaptation strategies. Okay, moving on now to our political engagement measures. And I'll kind of move through this a bit more quickly because we'll expand on each of these in a moment. But here we see that the extent of land rights is statistically significant in terms of predicting whether someone's likely to join a protest or raise an issue. But interestingly, so is eviction fear, right? So what we're seeing here, I'll highlight it here, right, is that both title deed or tenure security and insecurity are both helping to explain the likelihood of someone raising an issue. Okay, so again, we'll kind of explain what some of the mechanisms that we think are driving that, okay? different pathways to the same type of behavior. And then willingness to or interest in joining a protest. People living on collective or communal land are more likely to show interest there. And then for our last one, which I think is perhaps most important if we care about security and peace and stability, here we find that people living on communal land and who are tenure insecure, measured by eviction fear, those are the two key variables that predict support for violence strategies. And again, we'll expand on these below. Okay, I'll hand it over to Emma now.
Yes, so just to kind of talk each of these outcomes through in a little bit more depth and think about the implications. First of all, as Kathleen just said, we find that people who have stronger land rights, both in terms of this index that we created and in terms of holding a title deed, they are more likely to make household level adaptations. So things like investing in solar panels, investing in new crop varieties or whatever it may be, depending on the rural or urban context where they're living. As put by one of our focus group participants, if you own, you plan ahead. Renters can't plant trees on someone else's land. So these findings really sort of align with a lot of conventional wisdom, right? They show that security builds confidence to invest in resilience-enhancing changes. But also importantly, for this to work, formal titles alone are insufficient. So people must also trust that their rights will be enforced, as also kind of our qualitative data underlines. Moving on to collective adaptation, as Kathleen mentioned, we found that people who are living on public land and communal land were more likely to have been active in collective resilience efforts than those living in areas where land ownership is private. And conversely, that people who are living on private land were more likely to express that they would prefer relying on their household only to adapt. One of our respondents in Mombasa spoke about how the commodification of land alongside growing inequality has eroded community norms. So saying that ujamaa, kind of communal living, has disappeared, and nowadays you can sleep on an empty stomach while your rich neighbor throws away leftovers. So these findings point towards the role of the land tenure regime in shaping norms around individual and collective adaptation. But at the same time, we also found, as Kathleen said, that strong land rights predict both individual and collective adaptation. So having stronger rights make you more likely to have engaged in both of these. And people who had strong rights were also less likely to say they would prefer to rely only on their household. So these are quite important findings that point to these nuances. They underline that interventions should support and resource local governance structures that sustain cooperation. That's not necessarily just privatization, right? So the bottom line here is that where rights are shared and trusted, communities adapt together. And turning to political engagement, we found that strong land rights encourage advocacy, right? People with strong rights were nearly twice as likely to have joined a protest or raised an issue, according to our results. And taking together with our qualitative data from our focus group interviews, we interpret this as a result of stronger agency. But we also found that fear of eviction is also associated with political engagement, but this seems to be more driven by grievance. Our focus group interviews again give rich accounts of different ways that people experience this, how people try to solicit responsiveness from their leaders in the face of climate change, and also how sort of previous experiences of doing that can bolster such efforts, but also how and why other groups lack a sense of agency and do not engage politically. The key implication here is that political engagement stems from different sources, and that protecting tenure rights can channel mobilization towards constructive engagement. So the bottom line is that security fosters voice, whereas insecurity fosters resistance. And this also connects then to the final outcome that we studied. More support for more coercive and even violent strategies. So here, as Kathleen said, we find that tenure insecurity and specifically fear of eviction fuels support for coercion, including taking back land by force. We also found that strong rights reduced support for this, at least among rural respondents. We also found that land tenure regime matters and that people living on communal land were more likely to support a coercive strategy. This might be partly explained by a stronger sense of group identification because claims to land and resources are linked to ethnic group membership. Strong group identification coupled with economic and environmental precarity and political manipulation of identity in the Kenyan context provides a combination of incentives and capacity conducive to contentious mobilization. These two dimensions also interact, right? So a person's probability of agreeing with the pro-violence statement was 23 percentage points higher if they both fear eviction and are living on communal land compared to when they don't fear eviction and are not living on communal land. And our focus groups on communal land in rural Laikipia underlines a strong sense of threat. So respondents in the focus groups emphasized how climate change is a source and driver of conflict in their area, and they acknowledged the potential need for self-defense in the face of climate-induced conflicts. So these dynamics were most pronounced in the Conservancy area in Laikipia North, which is a context where banditry related to cattle raiding and grazing conflicts is a regularly occurring security challenge. Although it was seen as a last resort, the need to possibly take up arms for self-defense was recognized. So people said that we must protect ourselves in any way. So this implies that conflict-sensitive adaptation planning should address land grievances early. When rights are threatened, adaptation gives way to confrontation. And of course, institutions and trust in security structures to protect your rights play a key role here, as our interviews also underline.
Okay, so now stepping back a bit from the specifics of our finding, and what we were trying to do in this report is kind of think about the particular mechanisms that might be underlying our results. Now, recall that we don't have a way of testing these from our data. So these, I mean, this would be like an interesting discussion point, but based on my and Emma's field work and studying these questions for a while, we think that our study highlights kind of the different ways, a few potentially important ways through which land tenure can shape the ways that people are responding to climate-related threats, right? And so in particular, we see, or we think that land tenure is playing a powerful role in shaping perceptions of power and agency, affecting people's collective action capacity and activating their grievances, or under certain circumstances can activate grievances. Right? So here we can think about the ways that both the rules and norms shaping tenure, right, and the ways in which land tenure really structure or are a form of local social institutions, right, provide a really, I think, important window into thinking about how they shape behavior, both social and political, right, and the implications that such kind of relationships have for thinking about the ability for people to respond to climate-related threats, right? And so in particular, we see these mechanisms, right, of perceptions of power and agency, which we could call efficacy, collective action capacity, and grievance activation, is indeed going to, or likely is influencing how households and communities navigate climate risks, how they make decisions about how they're going to access and manage resources, and engage with state and non-state actors.
We also just wanted to emphasize that our survey underlines the persistence of a gender gap in land rights. So in our survey, we found that women have weaker land rights and are less likely to adopt many of the resilience strategies that we study. The table here shows the gender gap in rights, and other studies show an even bleaker picture in terms of formal rights, at least when looking at national averages. But we also found that women were less likely to have made household level adaptive changes to have engaged in collective adaptation, to have joined protests or be willing to do so in the future, and to have raised an issue to politicians. So they were less likely to adopt many of these strategies. And we don't think that women in our sample are ambivalent or agentless in the face of climate-related threats. Indeed, our focus group interviews show many ways that women are trying to insulate themselves from climate change. But this suggests that women's social power, which is partly a function and reflection of weaker land rights compared to men, also shapes the set of actions or responses that are feasible and thinkable and appropriate. To wrap up and to summarize, we find that different tenure systems shape whether adaptation happens individually and collectively. So we find that living on public or communal land leads to more collective adaptation, whereas living on private land leads to more household-only strategies. We find that strong rights matter. So we found that having secure rights leads to more adaptation and more political advocacy. We found that perceived insecurity matters. So people who fear eviction are more likely to mobilize, but also to support more coercive strategies. And we found that there's still a persistent gender gap, and that women's weaker land rights lead to fewer adaptation options and less political voice. And these 4 findings are crucial for anyone designing resilience policies. So they underline the relevance of land rights for climate resilience and the importance of incorporating a nuanced analysis of land tenure in any interventions that seek to improve resilience and climate adaptation. Importantly, our findings show that strong land rights are not necessarily the same as private land rights. It's important to separate the strengthening of land rights from the privatization of land. These are 2 distinct mechanisms. So policymakers should also recognize that formal tenure security does not always translate into perceived security, as our report shows. And policies that focus only on formal land titles risk to overlook key social, gendered, and political dynamics that may undermine tenure security. And taken together, while our report focuses on a specific geographic context, so urban and rural areas of Kenya, which features a particular political history and institutional landscape around land, our findings really underline the wider relevance of considering these different aspects of land tenure, so the tenure system, the strength of land rights, and perceived tenure security. And these have different implications for development outcomes. And while the precise relationships may differ across geographic context, the overall approach that we adopt in our study will be of relevance for understanding land tenure and how it shapes climate resilience anywhere. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to the discussion.
So thank you very much, Kathleen and Emma, for this rich and very interesting presentation. May I keep you for a while to ask you just a couple of follow-up questions? Even if your presentation was very rich and you were very clear on things, but a few things on the strategies, the collective strategy, community restoration, what could that be in practice? You said, you talked about household strategies and then community strategies for adaptation. What would an example of community restoration be?
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's important clarification. So there's a lot of ways that communities come together with respect to climate adaptation. Some include improving ditches so that when rains come or when floods come, and that requires a collective effort, right? These drainage pipes run through the community. So there's a lot of kind of infrastructure goods that are public goods and require collective action. Planting of trees. So yes, these can be done along people's fence lines and in people's, personal, like private land, but also communities can make decisions about whether they want to allocate a section of the community to tree planting. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, thank you. And that also highlights that here the issue of land is not only an issue of land, but also an issue of water. So you could also get at this from the angle of water. Drought and flooding are climate change effects. Too little or too much water. But that aside, now we're heading for a panel discussion, and I'll introduce, I don't see her on the screen right now, but maybe others do. Catherine Boone, you are professor of comparative politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE in London, and a distinguished scholar in the field of land issues, with many important engagement and achievements. Just to mention only one thing among the many, you wrote a book, Property and Political Order, Land Rights and the Structure of Politics in Africa, some years back, and you won the Lubbert Book Award for Best Book in Comparative Politics with that. So that's an indication of what you've been doing. And you were also a member of the reference group for this study. Can I ask what your reflections are on this, on the report and the presentations? Do you have any immediate thoughts, briefly? Please, Catherine.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Mats, for the very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this process, the earlier discussion of the report and also this seminar today. So thank you very much. I think what you asked us to do is to just say a few general comments at the beginning, and then maybe
please
get to something, questions, etc. later. So yeah, so just by way of very general comments, I have really enjoyed this process and learned a lot from the report. I thank the authors really for the entire endeavor and for the close-up study of household level adaptation strategies. And I think, maybe by way of just responding very generally, I would like to step back and say that I think in the land politics or land rights literature, there's kind of a general consensus that security is good. I mean, no one says that insecurity is better than security. And, this has become kind of a axiom, very general concept. A lot of research showing that, as the authors already noted, secure tenure can create incentives for people to invest, be it to enhance productivity or invest in ways of protecting their rights to land in the future. But I would say, the debates in this literature now have to do with what does security really mean in practice? What are the correlates of insecurity? What does of security and insecurity? And the question of security against what sort of threats are we talking about? And the multidimensionality of the author's way of operationalizing the concept of land tenure, I think, captures some of that. But then, we move to questions about security for whom. So security for party A can constitute insecurity for party B. And the questions also about process, like how do you go about making tenure more secure? And does that process itself generate a lot of, let's say, contradictions in the sense of the process itself can generate insecurity or can generate security that's unevenly distributed across groups. And the interactive effects of all of these variables are also very complex, I think, as we kind of see in some ways in the report. So I would say, from that perspective, this study extends the basic logic about the positive effects of security in the sense that it shows that, as the authors noted early on in their presentation, that, secure land rights at the household level, especially as represented by a title, can encourage people to literally invest in adaptation. So put solar panels on their roof. But I think the study also recognizes that the security of rights can mean different things and come in different ways for different people and groups. I think a very important innovation in what they do is to make political action, I would say political action at different levels, including collective action within the community, because that's an outcome of community level politics, makes political action the key dependent variable or outcome that the authors are interested in. And this is indeed exactly what I tried to highlight in the 2014 book that I wrote, sort of talking about land rights and the structure of politics. So land rights shaping your relationship with your neighbors, your relationship with local and national government, and sort of going far in determining what people understand their community to be when it comes to their control and access to resources and security thereof, and defining the relationship to the state at different levels. So I think this kind of focus and take on the argument as the authors have developed it goes far in explaining why land rights are so political. And, you know, in a way brings us back into the soup of that process then of the politics of going from A to B, of making insecure rights more secure, and indeed the reverse aspects. So that politics then perhaps even eroding a sense of security that people might have had in an earlier period. So I think it's a very important domain of study. And I also think that in a way, their understanding complexity and diversity, in some ways, this makes it harder for policy. So I'm very interested in hearing what my co-panelists see as the takeaways of the study for their concerns in the operational domain. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for us, for those who are sort of non-academics, the dependent variable is like the outcome.
The outcome.
And now you say that the outcome, that is, can be also working in the other direction, so that we don't have a static situation, but politics can make things worse, and maybe hopefully improve things as well. So that's more of an open discussion then. Mattias Rantanen, you are a project manager at the Department for International Services at Lantmäteriet, the Swedish Mapping, Cadastral Land Registration Authority. And in that role, you have been involved in supporting authorities or sister organizations and reforms in the field of land tenure in several countries, in Eastern Europe as well as in Africa. So you're a person with a lot of experience in working with land issues. Do you have any sort of brief reflections when seeing this report and hearing the presentation?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And to begin with, thank you for a very, I mean, giving an interesting presentation and report. I must say that there are some findings and aspects which actually in one way or another quite new for us to find a practical approach to. Highlighting land use rights from a climate adaptation perspective is partly, as said, new, but I think also the way you put it in from a household level as well. But this also expresses, as I see it, the complexity that we do encounter in various projects which we participate in. As you probably know, Lantmäteriet, or National Land Survey Sweden, our core business is like dealing with property information, registration, ownership of land. But among those other services, we are also responsible for geodetic services, putting up the infrastructure for surveying, GPS infrastructure, valuation of properties, and geodata distribution, and so on. So we are coming, how to say, from a more technocratic approach, and then have to deal with these issues with climate adaptation, but it also corruption, how to promote democracy, women's rights to land ownership, and so, which we need to find like a practical approach on. So this is like the challenge for us, how to include these perspectives and so on, even if we are a bit technical in what we're trying to achieve. But with that said, I think some key factors here for us is, I mean, we don't develop systems itself. Of course, it happens, but basically we work with competence, capacity building, transferring of competence, and supporting the national organizations. But we do believe that working also with the local organizations and NGOs are of importance, a key factor to actually see results on local level. That's our experience. So yeah, maybe I can stop there. Just a few basic, but thanks for these findings and conclusions.
Yeah, we'll talk more later. So the third member of the panel, and I should say also that Emma and Kathleen, you're included in the panel. We're here to discuss. But the third member, Henrik Häger Brundin, you are since a few weeks, I understand, a land coordinator for something called Agroforestry in Uganda. You just left a position as head of SwedBio, which is a development program working on biodiversity and ecosystem services with partners across the world, local partners, more sort of working also at international level. You have lived and worked in Kenya and in other countries in East Africa, and you have a specific interest in land issues, I understand. You have a lot of experiences as well, but maybe more from a community level, or yeah, you could describe that better than I can. But what do you have some initial reflections and comments, please, Henrik?
Yes, indeed, and thank you, Mats, for the introduction and for having me. Good morning, everyone. Also, for me, thanks to the authors. I have a general comment to start with. I think it's a balanced and very rich report, and I think partly due to the perception and preference take. The report paints a more balanced picture than we are normally used to. And I think it makes also very strong points for practitioners and implementation organizations such as Agroforestry or skogen in Sweden, working to fight poverty and climate change together. So bearing in mind how strong influence the tenure systems have when designing interventions is really crucial. And I think also from the Agroforestry's perspective on the individual versus the collective rights, the report emphasis on land tenure, it resonates deeply with our experience. And we also see that secure land rights and control over production resources are a prerequisite for farmers to invest in agroforestry and climate smart practices. And not at least, as pointed out, the gender and the social functions, these are very gendered questions. So without that, security, long-term resilience cannot really work well. The same for communal land governance. It's also very relevant. And I think especially in the northern part of Kenya, where we have indigenous peoples and many times shared land systems in arid and semi-arid lands, it can also, if governed properly, be a very powerful driver to climate adaptation. So I could come back with some few examples when we continue the discussion, but I think I'll stop there for now in the general introduction.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Kathleen or Emma, do you have any immediate reflections on what you've heard so far, or shall we go on?
I'll just say that, kind of echoing Catherine Boone's comments about kind of the challenge of taking something that's incredibly complex and extremely political and framing it in a way that has kind of not easy, but tangible implications for policymakers. I think that's been the challenge of this report and writing that. And so it's a balance. I think we struggled in trying to find a balance between recognizing the complexity and highly politicized nature of tenure systems, while also trying to be pragmatic about what we can tell the policy community. So.
If I start to ask Matthias you a question, because you work more on the sort of national level when you work with a country. You come in as a technical support, or so. How do you see all these sort of complexities and sort of nuances that we've heard about here? Can a nationwide system deal with these? I mean, a titling regime or titling system. How do you see this?
Yeah, but I think which also highlighted in the report. I mean, this is like a prerequisite to actually. You need to have a stable system. You need to have like sort of supporting systems to actually document and have records of land use rights, whether it's commune level or private or on state level. But as I said, I think still to have an understanding and get an acceptance, which also is mentioned, you need to have a trust in the institutions themselves among people in the country, and that's a challenge. So we see it as important. Okay, create the systems, but we really need to be on local level as well, together with the state, national institutions, together with local organizations as well, to actually find a way to collaborate on these different levels. The entrance for us, is usually coming in supporting a national institute or authority. That's the normal way for us in, but we always try to break it down on local level as well.
Okay. So, but this, I know that Kathleen and Emma, sorry, you say that formalization is not everything here. You could also have other systems as long as there is trust in the system. But Kathleen, what is your perspective on formalization? Is it important to formalize systems? And if we are to formalize, how can we go about that, given that the complexity that we have heard about here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think I would like to say something that actually picks up on the comments of the other discussants. So, when I was thinking about the report, what I was thinking is that, really to sort of see the effects of household level, of variation in the household level situation. What you really need to understand is the context. I mean, the political context and also the local sort of the community level context and sort of the way it's embedded in the larger political system. So you kind of need this information together to understand what's going on in any particular place. And I think the implication actually for policy is exactly what Matthias was saying, is that somehow, with respect to formalization or maybe more generic policy intervention, you probably need some kind of national level principles or commitments, but then the design and implementation of the particulars of any land rights security enhancing effort needs to match the political jurisdiction at which the people are able to participate and have a voice and observe what's going on. So there needs to be some kind of jurisdictional matching. And I think, one case study that the authors described that really sort of brought this home for me was the Mombasa case study. So if people are in a neighborhood, they're experiencing a collective problem. It's right there. It's also happening in their neighborhoods. They organize collectively, and then they take their problem to their local political representatives, as they scale up. So here, the scale of the problem or the challenge is kind of nested within the political jurisdiction. So people know where to go to participate and have voice. And I think you also see that in the conservancy examples in northern Kenya in the pastoral situation. There's a kind of jurisdictional match between the scale of the challenge, where people can organize, and where they can find political voice that will be effective. So I think this is, with respect to formalization, one thing that I would say, sort of as Matthias just said, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all crafted and implemented from the top down. You have general principles, but then the actual particulars of design and implementation have to match the jurisdictional scale at which people are represented and feel like they can access the state, to bring them into constructive engagement with the state and reinforce then the legitimacy of the state institutions.
Can I ask the same question to you, Henrik? Or perhaps not the same, but the need for a joint jurisdiction, some framework at national level. How do you see that working on sort of at a local level? Is that always helpful?
So for the case of Kenya, and I do agree with the previous speakers, for the case of Kenya, the system is quite complex. There are a multitude of legislations and sometimes overlapping responsibilities, overlapping government ministerial responsibilities, and there is also a temporal aspect. I think it was mentioned by the author several times that land issues in Kenya are deeply political, and I would probably go further and say that it's so highly politically sensitive that it's shaping most of Kenya's political economy since the colonial times. And in fact, the Land Act that was in force in the new constitution, it actually also deals with historical injustices. So taking us back to 1895 gives the local communities, just to talk about the temporal space here, and of course, it is extremely hard to have that enforceable, but it's just to mention that it's multi-stratified, and I think on the more positive side, I think we do see some registration, especially in the pastoral communities in the north with the indigenous peoples groups, also the Communal Land Act, which also enables them to register land and to do exactly what we're talking about here, making up as the next step then management plans for that area. So
could
yes,
I follow up?
as much as it's needed, but it's very complex, I would say. But it is happening.
But you mentioned the pastoral community here. Also, Kathleen and Emma, you wrote about that. You've found something about it, that pastoralists are sort of more likely to take on certain strategies. Would that link up in any way with what Henrik just mentioned, the Communal Land Act?
I mean, if I can come in here, I think it's important also when we talk about this to remember that formalization does not necessarily entail private land tenure, right? So as Henrik was talking about, there is a legal framework for formalizing communal rights. So that can mean that you have very strong communal rights to land. And I saw also there was a question in the Q&A about this, about sort of traditional, and we'll get to that later. But I mean, you can have strong rights that are vested in the community, and then within that community, you can have very strong sort of informal, if you will, or customary traditional rules for how land is held by individuals and households within that community. So that can also be a strong and to some extent formalized way of holding land. And I think that's what we see in the conservancy areas, that there are groups that have been able to formalize their communal land holding, and that gives them a sense of kind of collective efficacy in protecting and investing in that land through conservancy efforts, through kind of grazing protection and these things. So I think that kind of gets to that question. And I think, I mean, there's also urban examples of this. I think an interesting case is the Nubian community in Nairobi, who have been struggling for a long time to get a communal title deed for their land in Kibera, which they were sort of promised early on by the British colonial power. And for them, this has been a way to get become recognized as citizens by having land that belongs to the community, sort of a sense of political agency in that way. So it's not only about the economic interests in the land. So I think that it's important to keep those a little bit apart, that you can have strong rights and even formal rights, even if they're not private rights.
Okay. I will now pose a question which is extremely difficult to answer. So I don't blame you if you cannot answer it. I cannot myself, I think. The question is, if you say that a tenure system need to be legitimate, how does you build that legitimacy in a system? Are there ways and means that you could sort of act so that you build trust in a system? We could have that question if anyone is not jumping at it. Henrik, have a go.
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, this is an extremely complicated question. But I through the interactions with indigenous peoples groups in the north of Kenya in my previous work with Swedbio, before the panel today, I just asked, so how do you trust the system when the government is not coming through? And I think a very interesting thing we see in the civil society sector is that groups, farmers, indigenous peoples are organizing themselves. So it is a bit different in the communal space versus the private individual ownership, as Emma so correctly pointed out. But I then posed the question, so how do you trust the government, or why is it working? Why are the communities jumping on this registration? And very interestingly, they trust their local organizations. They trust the leaders. And then I said, but what about the government? You trust the government? And the answer was, have you ever seen the government coming to assist us in northern Kenya? That was the question. So the distrust is massive versus the government, whereas trusting the process for registration somehow seems to be working. So it's an attempt of one type of answer, building trust slowly, Mats. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Kathleen, you have something to add.
Yeah, I'll bring in the political dimension here for a moment, which is under kind of in the background here. But in this question of how can a tenure system be legitimate, so much of that depends on a community's relationship to the state. And that's partly kind of which ethnic community are we talking about, kind of going back to history, right? The Kikuyus have a very different relationship to the state historically than, say, the Mijikenda on the coast. And so what I found, like way back a decade ago when I was writing my first book on this question of land and violence, right? I asked a question about like whether people would prefer ancestral land, which is kind of a loose way of saying communal land, or private land. And I mean, that people on the coast, like they have this history of slavery and dispossession and distrust in the state, and they think that ancestral land is the more legitimate system, but they are also pragmatic, right? And know that if they are going to have any hope of holding on to rights, of attaining political power, of not being displaced, they also need to get a title deed. And so there's this really interesting tension between what a community thinks of as right and legitimate, like what should be, and their own kind of pragmatism about politics and what do they need to protect themselves. And so, I mean, and then of course, communities who have benefited from titling campaigns and registration, right? They're like, private tenure system is great, sign me up, right? So there's like very different, like I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it's not just how can tenure systems be legitimate, but we have to kind of think about that question in the context of politics and history and who has benefited from state patronage or state policies, if to state it less politically, and who has been excluded or who has actively lost their land through state titling programs or land reform broadly. And so it's not to bring simplicity, but rather to bring more nuance. But that is just like, it's again a very contextual, like a locally specific question about who is going to trust what system, but also maybe that trust isn't the only question, right? It's also this idea of we trust ancestral rights, but also we want title to our land.
Okay. When Emma, you mentioned something earlier, I came to think that these issues, land rights, climate adaptation, access to land, it's also linked very much to conflicts. You've looked at the political activity or even the sort of violent acts that's possible, and I think we should remind ourselves that a lot of conflicts are around land issues and access to land. So that is also an aspect here. But you wanted to come in on something else, Emma, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on to what we were talking about and about how to create trust in the system. And I think Henrik's point and Henrik's example sort of raises two things that also resonate with other research, right? That trust building is something that, trust in the state and trust in the system can be built through performance, so through feeling that the system delivers something for you on the one hand, but also that trust building is relational, so that you can build trust with local representatives of the state, even if you don't trust the central state. And I think that resonates. It's a different topic, but other research on policing in Kenya that I have done with colleagues that shows that even if Kenyans really distrust, it's extremely low trust in the police in Kenya, people still build conditional trust with their local police officers, given that they are performing in a good way. So I think that maybe gives a partial answer to that it's something that can be done at the local level, and maybe then devolution offers a little bit of hope for that. I think also to connect to Mattias' work, that maybe through over time, to give some tech optimism through a transparent system, maybe people can also build trust that no one will undermine their rights if it's more possible to monitor and access that type of information.
Mattias, you want to add something there?
Yeah, no, I would actually raise a question to my colleagues in the panel, if it's okay.
Sure.
It's related to, discussing this with the conflicts offshore, we know from Sweden, the land use itself is always associated with conflicts. That's all conflicts in interests, whether it's agriculture or it could be other interests, exploitation of land and so on. But as I see it, we also need to have other supporting legalization and supporting frameworks to support these legal land use issues as well. For instance, like natural protection or environmental protections and so on, and institutions working with it. But how do you relate to these supporting frameworks outside the security of land rights? Do you deal with those kind of questions in your study or in your projects?
Oh, that's a good question. Anyone? Henrik first here.
Yeah, so I'll make a quick attempt, and from the agroforestry's perspective, we're talking about rights, like basic human rights, but also engagement with the government in the whole process as duty bearer. And I think without addressing rights in a more holistic way, we will not succeed. So ultimately, that trust building or that relational that we have talked about, of course, it's an intermediary for the government, ideally, to come in and assume full responsibility. So I think the framework you're talking about could be temporal, but a bridge over to the fact that the government currently, at least, is distrusted and not in a position, sometimes underfunding, at least in some of the regions in Kenya in this area. So a first take would be to have an holistic view and emanate from a rights-based perspective.
So
Thanks.
basically, agreeing with Matthias here. Matthias, I'd like to come back to you on one question, because we are discussing Kenya quite intensively here. But I mean, land issues are relevant also in other settings. You work in Eastern Europe as well.
Yes.
Could you see similarities with the sort of setting, with the problems, with the challenges you meet in such countries? What Kathleen and Emma are discussing, would that be relevant in the Eastern European countries that you work in?
Yeah, I think the relevance especially in creating trust in institutions, trust in systems, and of course you have to deal with similar questions. But basically, of course, as you know, the socio-economic situation comparing Eastern Europe and with sub-Saharan countries, of course, I mean, completely different. And I mean, creating these systems, for instance, I work in Serbia, we do have in Bosnia Herzegovina. It's very, and mass population is very much related to create a climate for good investments, having the properties as a secure for mortgages and loans and whatsoever. I assume the situation right now, we have a pre-study in Mozambique. I mean, all land is either commune or state-owned land, and it's maybe not the basis for investment like it should be in Eastern Europe. So there are, of course, huge differences as well, but also similarities.
Okay, Henrik, what would you say, Kenya and Uganda? Is it comparable?
Yeah, so I would like to think so. Somehow it sounds intuitive that the research conducted and reported here on land rights and decision making and so on, if you look at the data, it would suggest so. But we need also to remember that the historical events differ. The legislation also differs quite a lot between the East African countries. So I think I would love to continue research to see whether this is also fully or partly applicable in the other East African countries. And I think a note to self, I think, would be that what is somehow not surprising or maybe even intuitive, it's sometimes overlooked in development corporations. I think the report has very valid, made some very valid points for us moving forward and to remember. Yeah. So I think.
Yeah, I think you've outlined the challenges there and also the possibilities. We now have some questions coming in from the audience, and I have with me my colleague Matilda Videll, who will read out questions here to us in the panel here.
Yes, we have got some questions for you. From an anonymous person comes the first question. When talking about different kinds of land tenure, have you also come across traditional ownerships through chiefdoms? In that case, do you include that form of communal tenure? Have you observed the differences in the response to climate change in the event of cases of traditional ownership?
I assume that is a question for Kathleen and Emma first and foremost.
I can try here. So Kenya is an interesting case in that chiefs they operate a bit differently than they might in, say, a case like Zambia, in that they are kind of a relic of the political and colonial political state, and so that they're state employees. And so this is actually a case thinking about comparability, right, across tenure systems, where the way in which chiefs operate within communal systems in Kenya might be distinct from, say, Malawi or Zambia. So we don't have a measure of kind of chief, the role of the chief within these communal systems. I think that's an interesting question of kind of probing variation within communal systems. It's just not something we did in this study. I expect that we would see differences. I expect that kind of where chiefs, I mean, in the Kenya context, it's more like how legitimate is a given chief within a space. Whereas if we were doing a cross-country comparison, I think that could be really valuable and getting kind of more leverage here about like how different types of chiefs or chieftaincy institutions or broadly traditional institutions, do we see variation within those spaces in terms of how they are kind of either empowering communities to address climate changes, or in some cases it might act as hindrances. So that might be not an entirely satisfying answer, but it's a good question, and we kind of get at it, but not entirely.
And there might also be differences between the French colonial system with chiefs and the British. Matilda, do you have more questions?
Yes, I do. It's Christopher Ristinma. He writes that the Red Cross has been working on community resilience for a long time, including locally led actions adapting to climate change. Some community agreed actions are collective actions, and some are on household level, all based on community structures and way of organizing themselves. Apart from assuring having the community members leading the work to ensure action suits the local context, where land tenure probably is one critical aspect, shaping how the community members form their action plans. What would be your recommendations for organizations such as Red Cross in taking land tenure rights into account when working with communities on climate resilience? Did you... Your recommendations to the Red Cross.
That's a really tough question. I think, I mean, trying to think about the implications from our study for this specific question, I think one implication would be to do exactly that, to work with local communities who probably have the best insights into the constraints and the dynamics and the norms and rules that are relevant, right? Maybe what we would could add to that would be to zoom out and have a political analysis of the sort of the power relations governing land. If trying to think about what sort of the possibilities for different approaches to be successful, do you need to target also certain political elites to ensure that they are on board, or things like that, maybe, and trying to think about, are there, I mean, given the local situation, are some groups benefiting but not others, and could that create tensions around land? Maybe those types of more political science dimensions is something that we could add. I don't know, Kathleen, do you want to add something else?
I mean, this is a tricky question. I think I would suggest that just thinking about land tenure as a lens for kind of predicting or thinking about where are communities more likely to work well together and organize, and where might the Red Cross run into problems or run into issues, right? So kind of taking our findings, it might be that, and here maybe it depends kind of where, see, I'm looking for the country. If there might not be much variation in the kind of broader land tenure system. So it's kind of thinking about how is land governed locally, however you want to label that, and the way in which land is governed locally might give you some clues into how other forms of collective action might unfold. So more as like a lens or a way of kind of anticipating points of strength in terms of how communities might come together, but also potential for conflict or just disinterest.
Would there be any other question, Matilda?
Yes, we have another from Åsa Davidsson. She served as a country manager for a Swedish organization in Liberia, and she sees some similarities and some differences. But her question is, did your research also explore the capacities for women and other marginalized groups to make productive use of land they have acquired?
I think you were looking at that to some extent. So who would answer?
I mean, we don't specifically study how they make use of the land, but I think our findings have implications about that. So when to some extent, I talked about this gap in both in land rights and in adaptation, like adaptive strategies, right? So on the one hand, we find that women have less rights, but we also find that they're less likely to take many of these adaptive strategies. And that is even when we sort of account for their land rights. So if we look at the sort of our full regression tables that you can access online if you want to, we can see that even when we sort of control for these measures of land rights that are our main variables of interest, gender also plays in. So women are less likely to take most of these adaptive strategies, even when accounting for their land rights. So that says something, I think, about the other, like there's a lot of other constraints here that have effects on women's ability to, even when they hold land, to make use of that land in the same way as men. And that's a little bit outside of the scope of our study. But it's clear that those implications are there, and I think that might also hold for other dimensions of marginalization, but that we did not look at specifically in this study.
Matilda, there is another question, I understand.
Yeah, the last one from Anonymous. Considering there is a lot of literature on the land tenure security, on that land tenure security is key for agriculture investment. To what extent is it surprising that perceived tenure security enhances investment in climate adaptation? And what would you say that your study contributes to the existing literature from a more academic perspective?
I think that indeed is like the least surprising finding, right? So we have these three main outcomes, and like the first, I think, is the more conventional approach of like, does land tenure and tenure security in particular affect, say, investment, right? And that is a very like Hernando de Soto sort of finding, albeit with some nuance, right? In the sense that we're also looking not just likelihood for enhancing private, right, making kind of household level changes, but I think the collective, right, the like under what conditions do people work collectively, I think is a bit more innovative in that regard. I'd say, like from my perspective, I think the kind of more interesting parts, or not interesting, but like new parts of the study are that we are thinking about climate resilience, not just in like, are you changing the type of seed or fertilizer that you use, but how are you engaging politically? How are you working with others in your community to engage politically, right? Kind of how is it that land and tenure systems are shaping your proclivity or your likelihood of, say, joining a protest? And then this third dimension of like thinking about resilience, right? Not in just these pro-social forms, but these potentially antisocial forms as well. Like under what conditions might someone think of raiding cattle as not legitimate, but as a necessary way to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change? So I'd say it's the way that we expand what climate resilience means to look at these different forms of political behavior. And then equally kind of how we're nuancing tenure and tenure security beyond just, yeah, it's true that people have been looking at perceived or subjective tenure security and objective for a while. But that we have these kind of multi-dimensional aspects within tenure perceptions, within kind of extent of rights and tenure systems. So it's just kind of how that comes together to provide a more holistic view about potential effects of tenure systems and security. But
yeah, I think we have time for another question.
Yes.
Matilda from the audience.
Now they're dropping in. What made you choose the particular 3 dimensions of climate resilience that you use in the study? Did you rely on other resilience studies, your own field experience, or both others?
I think Kathleen already got to that a little bit, but coming from our own background, doing research in Kenya and other contexts, but also from the broader political science and peace and conflict literature that we are familiar with, we were interested in looking both at the individual and collective dimension of this. So a lot of work has focused mainly on individual level adaptation. We wanted to include both individual and collective, and also that we wanted to include both the more pro-social and the more contentious strategies. So that is basically how we ended up with these different strategies. We also considered early on in the study to include migration, which could be another resilience strategy that we did not end up including, because we wanted to focus on, given the setup of the study, we sort of needed to focus on strategies that people take when they are remaining in one particular space. But that could have been an additional strategy that could have been interesting to add.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here quickly to say like what didn't make it into the study. And I think our thinking as political scientists was trying to think about resilience in the framework of exit voice loyalty. And of Hirschman's idea of like, when do people flee, leave, migrate? When do they speak out? And when do they kind of just comply within the kind of norm, like the status quo, right? So we're still kind of thinking about seeing these different outcomes as overlapping with this kind of exit voice loyalty. So we pulled that from the report because it's a bit too academic perhaps, but that was kind of our initial theoretical entry point in thinking about resilience strategies.
So I think we are about to
I could
wrap up. There is another question there.
Yeah, it's such a great question from Markrättigheter Nilsson. What would be the researcher's dream study as a follow-up to this one?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a great final question.
That's final. Yeah, I have a final question also for the panelists, but we can start with the researchers. Your dream study, Kathleen or Emma?
I mean, I think we would just want to implement this approach across a much broader set of across several countries, across different communities, and more data, more surveys, more focus groups, and really dig down into these dynamics even more. I think that would be my dream, at least.
Yeah, my dream would be to be able to test a bit more or kind of hone in on how context is shaping, like kind of the kind of local political factors and national shaping tenure systems. That's kind of that, like our study starts after that point, and really a way of getting at these mechanisms. So we speculate about these mechanisms at work, and it'd be really neat to be able to kind of test those more empirically.
And to the panelists, the 1 minute take on what are the things that you take with you from this report, from this discussion? Who would like to start? Matthias, are you ready?
Yeah, I can start. I actually would like to pick up one of the questions from Christopher Ristinma. Actually, the question on what would be your recommendations for organizations such as Red Cross? Well, I can relate to what would be your recommendations for an organization like Markrättigheter as well. I mean, finding a methodology and a way to break it down in practical operational projects. That I think would be interesting to follow and elaborate.
Thanks. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. I think what I would, as a kind of takeaway, I would like to build on the last comment, but also something Kathleen was saying. So Kathleen was saying one implication is to understand that different communities are, governed, as it were, or embedded in different kinds of land tenure systems. But I think what I would add is not precluded by what she said, but in going into a particular situation to try to understand land tenure relationships between people within a local context, because that, will go far in helping to explain maybe uneven patterns of different interests, of course, and uneven patterns of willingness to participate in different things. That this going back to the author's original idea, that this also shapes individual dynamics within a community. I think that would be a really relevant takeaway. Yeah.
Thank you. Henrik.
Yes, thank you. Well, even though advocating for more research on this also in other countries, I think as an implementer, we need to also assume responsibility and have some ownership of what is already being presented. And I think what is the advice to the policymaker very well resonates with advice to an implementer. And I really take that forward. I think we mentioned also in reference to the Red Cross question, knowledge do exist, and there are knowledge systems, various localized solutions that we really can build on. The framework, the legislation is not perfect, but there are things we can do. So that would be my main take from this session. Thank you, Mats.
Thank you. And with this, I'd like to thank you all. Catherine, Emma, Henrik, Kathleen, Matthias, for your contributions here to the discussion. This discussion needs to continue in other forms and formats. We're at the end of the webinar. The report, Land Tenure and Climate Resilience, Household Level Evidence from Kenya, can be downloaded from our website, www.eba.se. You can also find information about future seminars and webinars organized by us and link to our podcast. Thanks for your engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.